Welcome to First Sleep Aid, calm stories to help you unwind, learn, and fall asleep. From true crime to curious facts and thoughtful ideas, always softly spoken. Subscribe now and take a deep breath. You're in good hands. Welcome. Today we're taking a deep dive into a truly remarkable life journey.
We are. We're exploring the path of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the man who became Pope Francis.
Our idea is to really trace his steps, look at the key moments, the influences that shaped him, his experiences, and ultimately his worldview.
Exactly. Trying to build a rich picture, offer some deeper understanding without getting bogged down in, constant citations. Just the story.
Okay, so where does this story begin?
It starts in Buenos Aires, Argentina, December 17th, 1936.
Right.
He was born in Flores, which was, well, a pretty working-class neighborhood back then.
And his family?
He was the first son, eldest of 5 children. His parents were Italian immigrants. Mario, his father, worked as a railway accountant, and his mother, Regina, was a homemaker.
So first generation Argentinian, that must have had an impact.
Oh, undoubtedly. Their home, though modest, was, well, deeply Catholic. Faith wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was really part of their daily life.
Yeah.
Blessing meals, saying the rosary together, simple acts of charity in the neighborhood.
So those values were instilled really early on.
Absolutely. Humility, service, resilience. These things were baked in from the start. I mean, he was a kid, loved soccer, loved the tango, like many Argentinians.
Sure.
But people who knew him back then describe him as thoughtful, approachable, serious, yes, but kind underneath.
And Buenos Aires itself at that time, you mentioned contrasts earlier.
Exactly. It was a city of, well, stark contrasts. You had this grand European-style architecture, and then right nearby, sprawling shanty towns, the villas miserias.
Right.
There was a vibrant intellectual scene, but also constant political instability. The church had huge influence, yet poverty was everywhere.
That kind of environment, seeing that daily, it must leave a mark on your consciousness.
You'd have to think so. Seeing those extremes day in, day out.
Now, his path wasn't initially straight towards the priesthood, was it? I remember reading something about chemistry.
That's right. He actually studied chemistry, even worked in a lab for a while. Then, around age 21, during confession, he had this profound experience.
The big moment.
He described it less as a dramatic, lightning bolt, and more as a deep, quiet sense of peace, a conviction, a call to religious life.
Okay. And from that calling, he chose a specific path within the church, the Jesuits. Why them?
Well, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, they're known for a few key things. Intellectual rigor, a strong missionary history, and a really deep commitment to education and social justice.
So not necessarily the easiest or most direct route to, say, climbing the church ladder in Argentina at the time.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Choosing the Jesuits meant signing up for obedience, sacrifice, and a real willingness to be sent anywhere, often to the margins where the need was greatest.
A conscious choice for service then, right from the start.
Definitely. He entered the Jesuit novitiate in 1958. Then came years of intense formation, spiritual exercises, studying philosophy, theology.
He also taught for a while, didn't he?
Yes, literature and psychology in Jesuit high school, so he got that practical experience too. And critically, he was immersing himself in Ignatian spirituality.
Which emphasizes
Things like discernment, carefully figuring out God's will, humility, and this core idea of finding God in all things in everyday life, not just in church. That Jesuit formation was fundamental.
And all this is happening while Argentina itself is going through, well, its own turbulent times.
Absolutely. Political upheavals, deep social inequalities, the constant tension between conservative forces and calls for reform, those realities were always there in the background and sometimes the foreground.
So even as he's in this formation process, he's seeing poverty, the need for service, maybe even subtle resistance.
Those early lessons were surely being absorbed. It's the beginning, isn't it?
Yeah.
From Flores to, eventually, the Vatican, starting with that simple, quiet yes to a life of service.
And that life of service took a very difficult turn in the 1970s, a really dark period for Argentina.
That's right. The 70s brought the military dictatorship, the period known as the Dirty War. It was brutal, an atmosphere of fear, disappearances, just terrible uncertainty.
And right in the middle of this, Bergoglio steps into a major leadership role.
He does. In 1973, he becomes the provincial superior for the Jesuits in Argentina. He was only 36.
Wow, that's young for such a huge responsibility.
Immense responsibility, leading priests, educators, spread across a nation that was tearing itself apart.
How did he handle that, leading in such a dangerous time?
His approach seems to have been one of, well, cautious pragmatism. His main focus was protecting the lives of the Jesuits under his charge and preserving the church's ability to function, to minister.
So, less overt political activism.
Generally, yes.
Hmm.
He discouraged Jesuits from getting too directly involved in ways that could endanger them or the institution. He feared the repercussions.
And this approach, his actions during that time became controversial later on, didn't they?
They did. He faced criticism, particularly regarding two Jesuit priests involved in social work inspired by liberation theology, Orlando Yorio and Francisco Jalix.
They were kidnapped, weren't they?
Yes, kidnapped and tortured by the military. Questions were raised later about whether Bergoglio did enough to protect them beforehand, or enough to push for their release afterwards, or if he should have spoken out more forcefully against the regime itself.
It sounds incredibly complex. A damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation, perhaps.
It's certainly debated. There are conflicting accounts. Some argue he worked quietly behind the scenes, using contacts to help people, to offer refuge where he could. Others feel he prioritized institutional caution over prophetic witness.
Mm.
What seems clear is that the dirty war left a deep, indelible mark on him. He learned firsthand about the dangers of ideology taken to extremes, the terrible cost of defiance, and frankly, the moral gray areas leaders face under tyranny.
After that intense period as provincial superior, what happened next for him? Did he step back?
There was a period of, let's say, retreat and reevaluation. He went for further theological studies in Germany for a time, then returned to more humble pastoral roles in Argentina, away from the main centers of power for a bit.
A time for reflection, perhaps?
It seemed that way. A period marked by silence, service, deep internal discernment. Maybe processing what he'd been through.
Did his leadership style change after that?
It appears his approach solidified. A preference for quiet, patient work, dialogue over denunciation. Maybe a sense that real change takes time, humility, and sometimes bearing misunderstandings. Less grandstanding, more quiet action.
So a figure emerges who's maybe complex, conservative doctrinally, but compassionate personally.
That's a good way to put it. Conservative in doctrine, yes, but increasingly radical in his focus on mercy. Wary of ideology, but bold in compassion. You start to see the seeds of the future Pope Francis.
Yeah.
With all the seeming contradictions and surprises that would come later. Those difficult Argentinian years were incredibly formative.
Then eventually he's appointed back to a major role in Buenos Aires, this time as a bishop.
Yes, in 1992 he became auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires, and then in 1998 the archbishop. And this is where his distinctive leadership style really became visible to a wider audience.
How so? What stood out?
Well, almost immediately he started breaking the mold. He refused the usual trappings of the office. No grand archbishop's palace for him.
Right, he lived in a small apartment, I recall.
Exactly. Took public transport, the bus, the subway, cooked his own meals, and crucially, he spent a lot of time in the poorest barrios, the shanty towns, celebrating Mass there, just being present with people.
That's where the image of the bishop of the poor really took hold, wasn't it?
It absolutely did. And his preaching reflected that. He consistently talked about compassion, about mercy, more than condemnation. He used that image of the church as a field hospital after battle.
A field hospital, meaning the first priority is healing the wounded.
Precisely. Tend to the immediate needs first. But, his humility didn't mean he was passive. As Archbishop, he spoke out quite forcefully against secular trends he saw as damaging, against complacency within the church, too.
And against injustice.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Very critical of economic injustice, of corruption. He warned against political extremes, both left and right.
How did that go down with the political leaders in Argentina at the time, the Kirchners, for instance?
It was often tense. He clashed publicly with both President Nestor Kirchner and later his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, over issues of what he called moral decay, but also starkly over inequality. They definitely saw him as something of a political adversary.
But he tried to stay above partisan politics.
He navigated it carefully. He was forceful on principles, but avoided getting drawn into direct party politics. The focus always seemed to circle back to the poor, to the church's mission of service.
And within the wider Catholic Church, how was he seen during this period?
His reputation grew. He was involved in key commissions, especially within the Latin American Bishops' Conference, CLAM. He developed this vision of a more pastoral, inclusive church. Among fellow bishops, he was known for his spiritual depth, his intellect, but also that striking personal simplicity.
So that mix again. Traditional doctrine, but revolutionary mercy.
Exactly. He upheld traditional teachings, no question, but he reached out constantly to those on the margins. He wasn't pushing political liberation theology in the way some had earlier, but he absolutely lived out the preferential option for the poor.
He was becoming a symbol then of a different kind of church.
I think so. Less focused on power and palaces, more like a refuge. A church that, as he'd later say, wasn't afraid to get its shoes dusty, that knew the smell of the sheep. Unknowingly, perhaps, the world was starting to see the figure who would soon take on a much larger role.
And then came February 2013, Pope Benedict VI's resignation. That sent shockwaves, didn't it?
Huge shockwaves. The first papal resignation in nearly 600 years. It created this atmosphere of, well, uncertainty. What kind of leader did the church need now? What were the biggest challenges?
When the cardinals gathered for the conclave, was Bergoglio's name seriously in the running?
It was mentioned. People remembered he had apparently done quite well in the 2005 conclave that elected Benedict. But he wasn't seen as a frontrunner. He was 76, known for humility, not ambition. The focus was often on others.
What was the mood like among the cardinals going into that conclave? What were they looking for?
Well, the church was grappling with a lot. Issues within the Vatican bureaucracy, financial scandals, and overshadowing everything, the ongoing sexual abuse crisis. There was a strong feeling among many cardinals that they needed a reformer, someone who could bring transparency, healing, maybe connect with people who felt alienated.
And then the white smoke. And a surprise for many.
A big surprise for many observers, yes. March 13th, 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio elected Pope.
And his choice of name Francis, that felt significant immediately.
Absolutely. Choosing Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, the saint associated with poverty, simplicity, peace, rebuilding the church. It was the first clear signal. This might be a different kind of papacy.
His first appearance on the balcony also seemed to reinforce that.
It really did. Just the simple white cassock, no ornate red cape, and that gesture, bowing and asking the crowd to pray for him before he gave his blessing. Very striking. Very humble.
And the changes started happening quickly after that, didn't they?
Almost immediately. Declining the grand papal's apartments in the Apostolic Palace, choosing to live in the more communal Casa Santa Marta guest house.
Simpler transport, too. Less reliance on the bulletproof Pope-mobile.
Right. And his first trips weren't to global power centers. He went to a youth detention center in Rome for Holy Thursday, visited Lampedusa to highlight the migrant crisis, went to hospitals, always directing attention to the peripheries.
That focus on mercy and outreach really resonated globally, didn't it? The People's Pope label emerged quickly.
It did. There was a sense of renewed hope for many, including Catholics who felt maybe disconnected from the institution. This focus on mercy felt like a fresh start.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. He faced huge challenges right away.
Oh, immense challenges. Resistance to reform from within the Vatican Curia itself. Opposition from more conservative Catholics who worried his pastoral approach might be watering down doctrine.
And pressure from the other side, too, from progressives wanting faster change.
Exactly. Pressure for bigger shifts on issues like LGBTQ plus inclusion, the role of women, priestly celibacy. He was navigating between these often opposing forces.
How did he handle that pressure?
You saw that pragmatism again, perhaps honed in Argentina? Trying to avoid extremes, pushing for gradual change through discernment and dialogue, emphasizing encounter over confrontation.
So not overturning doctrine, but changing the tone, the emphasis.
That seemed to be the core approach, shifting from perhaps a language of condemnation to one of invitation, from rigidity to compassion. His first major document, Evangelii Gaudium, The Joy of the Gospel, laid out this vision.
What was the core message there?
A call for a missionary church, one that goes forth to the peripheries geographically and existentially, prioritizing the poor, seeing Christ in every person. That famous line comes from there, preferring a bruised, hurting, and dirty church that's been out on the streets to one that's unhealthy from being confined.
A powerful image.
It really set the tone. A new era was beginning, rooted less in institutional power and more in lived witness. He arrived as a shepherd, not a prince, ready to lead the church on an unexpected journey.
And that theme of mercy became the absolute cornerstone of his papacy, didn't it?
Absolutely. Right from the start, mercy was central. It wasn't just a theme, it felt like the theme.
His view of the world as a field hospital really captures that, I think.
It does. The idea that the first response in a wounded world shouldn't be judgment or complex rules, but compassion, healing the immediate wounds.
And the Jubilee Year of Mercy in 2015 really drove that home.
That was a huge, visible manifestation of it. A whole year dedicated to forgiveness, reconciliation, reaching out to the marginalized. Opening those symbolic holy doors of mercy all around the world was a powerful invitation.
He kept talking about the church needing to go forth. What did that mean in practice?
It meant getting out of the church buildings, out of the comfort zones, going to the edges geographically, socially, existentially. He wanted pastors, as he famously said, with the smell of the sheep, leaders who were close to their people, who understood their struggles.
We saw specific actions reflecting this too, like the change regarding absolution for abortion.
Right. He extended the permission for all priests to absolve the sin of abortion indefinitely. That wasn't a change in church teaching about abortion itself, but it was a very significant pastoral shift, making forgiveness more accessible, emphasizing mercy in that difficult situation.
And this theme ran through his major writings, his encyclicals.
Definitely. In Laudato Si's on Care for Our Common Home, he connects environmental responsibility directly to mercy for the poor, who suffer most from ecological damage.
Right, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Exactly. And in Fratelli Tutti, he calls for global fraternity, social friendship, pushing back against exclusion and indifference. It's all rooted in that fundamental call to see the other with compassion.
And then there was that famous off-the-cuff remark, "Who am I to judge?" regarding gay priests. That really caught global attention.
It absolutely did. While the context was specific and theologically careful, the phrase itself resonated so widely because it seemed to capture this desire for a less judgmental, more accompanying church, a church that meets people where they are.
But this strong emphasis on mercy wasn't without its critics within the church itself.
No, definitely not. It generated significant pushback from more traditionalist corners.
What were their main concerns?
Worries about doctrinal clarity, that the focus on mercy might seem to dilute core teachings or create confusion among the faithful. Some felt it could blur important moral lines in an effort to be welcoming.
And this led to things like the dubia.
Yes, the formal questions submitted by some cardinals seeking clarification on points in Amoris Laetitia, his document on marriage and family life. They were challenging his interpretation and application of doctrine in complex pastoral situations.
How did Francis respond to that kind of criticism?
Consistently, his response was a call for more dialogue, for discernment, for walking together. He framed mercy not as weakness or as being opposed to truth, but as the highest expression of God's love and strength.
So for him, the church's core mission was
To be that sign and instrument of God's mercy in a very broken world. Love, forgiveness, welcome, that had to be the first word, the defining characteristic.
It feels like he was trying to reorient the whole Catholic imagination around mercy.
I think that's a good way to put it. Shifting the focus. Seeing the church less as a fortress with strict gatekeepers and more as a home with open doors, building bridges, believing no one is beyond the reach of grace.
Yet despite that powerful message of mercy, his papacy wasn't free from significant challenges and criticisms on other fronts.
No, absolutely not. While mercy was central, his time as pope was definitely marked by difficult issues and considerable criticism.
The sexual abuse crisis being perhaps the most prominent and painful.
Without a doubt. He took some significant steps, new protocols, holding summits, apologies, but the criticism often focused on the pace being too slow, the actions sometimes seeming too cautious, too focused on internal church processes, rather than perhaps prioritizing survivor needs and external accountability.
There were specific high-profile cases that drew a lot of scrutiny, weren't there? McCarrick, Barros.
Yes, those cases definitely cast a shadow. There were perceptions, at least initially in some instances, of defensiveness or reluctance from the Vatican before stronger action was taken, often after significant public outcry.
So a tension sometimes between the message of mercy and the demands of justice.
Critics certainly pointed that out, that the Pope who preached mercy so powerfully sometimes seemed to struggle to apply justice with the same speed or clarity in these incredibly difficult cases.
And what about internally, within the Vatican itself?
There was definite resistance to his efforts at curial reform, trying to overhaul the Vatican's central administration. That wasn't easy, and progress was slower than many hoped.
And the theological debates continued.
Oh, yes. Traditionalist voices remained critical, worrying about a weakening of Catholic identity. Amoris Laetitia continued to be a flashpoint, leading to those public disagreements and the dubia.
Beyond the church, his stances on global issues also drew fire, didn't they?
They did. His strong critiques of aspects of global capitalism, his calls for action on climate change, his defense of migrants, these were praised by many but criticized by some, particularly political conservatives, who felt he was overstepping into secular politics.
It sounds like a papacy navigating constant turbulence.
It really was. But through it all, Francis seemed unwavering in his core vision, a church serving a wounded world. He appeared to accept that misunderstanding, even opposition, might be part of the deal when you're trying to live out the gospel prophetically.
Maybe seeing the turbulence as part of the journey towards authenticity.
Perhaps. He certainly didn't shy away from the complexities. He seemed willing to bear the disappointment, the division, the attacks, if it was in service of reconciliation and renewal.
So the legacy there is perhaps less about solving everything perfectly and more about the persistent engagement.
I think so.
Yeah.
An imperfect but persistent love. A deep commitment to mercy even amidst the struggles and criticisms. That really defines his mark.
And he really lived out that engagement through his travels, embracing the role of a global pilgrim.
Absolutely, with incredible energy, especially earlier on. And his focus was consistently on the margins.
Where did he tend to go?
Places often overlooked. Areas struggling with conflict, poverty, exclusion. His very first trip outside Rome set the pattern, Lampedusa.
The island receiving migrants crossing the Mediterranean.
Exactly. Standing there amidst the wreckage of boats, condemning the globalization of indifference, he was incredibly powerful.
And that pattern continued.
Yes. Going to the Central African Republic during conflict, Myanmar and Bangladesh, speaking up for the Rohingya, meeting refugees in Greece, visiting indigenous communities in the Amazon, praying at sites of genocide or atrocity. He prioritized forgotten places.
And his style during these trips often focused on simple gestures.
Very much so. Washing the feet of prisoners, including Muslims, on Holy Thursday, bowing before Holocaust survivors, praying silently at the wall between Israel and Palestine. It was about accompaniment, standing with people, not above them.
He also engaged in some significant diplomacy, didn't he?
He did, often quietly, behind the scenes. He played a role in the thaw between the U.S. and Cuba. He worked hard to foster dialogue with other Christian traditions, particularly the Orthodox Church, and significantly with leaders in Islam and Judaism.
The document on human fraternity was a key moment there.
A landmark, yes.
Yeah.
Signed in 2019 with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Abu Dhabi. A powerful joint call for peace and mutual respect between religions.
Did his global outreach face any criticism?
Some, yes. Particularly regarding engagement with regimes like China, questions were raised about whether human rights, especially religious freedom, were being adequately protected in those dialogues.
But his belief was in dialogue itself.
It seemed to be. That even imperfect dialogue is better than isolation and confrontation in such a fragmented world. For him, faith wasn't abstract doctrine. It had to be lived in solidarity with human suffering.
It really reshaped the image of the papacy, didn't it? From distant monarch to fellow pilgrim.
I think that's a very accurate way to describe it. His message, carried across the globe, was simple but radical. Mercy isn't just a nice idea, it's a path you walk, especially with those the world forgets.
And as he moved into his later years, that commitment remained, even as his health became more fragile.
Yes, absolutely. Even as his mobility became limited, requiring a wheelchair due to knee problems, his voice didn't weaken on those core issues.
What were his main focuses towards the end?
Continued advocacy for the marginalized, for peace, for fraternity, for environmental stewardship, deepening interreligious dialogue, constant calls for cooperation to tackle global problems.
In a way, his own physical struggles became part of his message.
You could say that. He embodied his teaching on leadership, needing proximity to suffering. He didn't hide his weakness, he bore it publicly, which itself is a kind of witness to human dignity and resilience.
Then, in 2024, his health took a more noticeable downturn.
Yes, there were several hospitalizations, concerns about respiratory and heart issues. Naturally, speculation about resignation grew louder.
But he chose to stay on.
He did. Consistent with his sense of duty, his commitment to service, he remained at his post, ministering as he could until the end.
His death on Easter Monday, April 21st, 2025, really marked the end of an era.
It truly did. Passing away at 88, in his simple room at Casa Santa Marta, the end of a papacy that really did try to reimagine the office around mercy and outreach.
The response was huge, wasn't it?
Immense. Pilgrims flooding into Rome, his body lying in state in St. Peter's. The funeral itself was conducted with the simplicity he'd requested, reflecting his life.
And his burial place.
He chose to be buried in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, a church he loved and visited often, especially before and after his trips.
Tributes poured in from all over.
From world leaders, religious figures, but also just countless ordinary people whose lives he had touched. He was remembered as that shepherd of the marginalized, a voice for compassion.
His passing left a void, certainly.
A palpable void, yes, in the church, but also in the wider global conversation. But, In death, as in life, he seemed to point beyond himself, towards that vision.
Yeah.
A church of mercy, a world of fraternity, a God found among the poor. His journey, his message of compassion, it continues to resonate.
So when we try to sum up his legacy, it's clearly complex, multifaceted.
Absolutely. It's not simple.
Yeah.
He'll definitely be remembered as the Pope of Mercy. That shift in tone, that prioritizing of the marginalized, the church that goes forth, that's undeniable.
But also a figure of controversy.
Yes. That pastoral flexibility, while welcomed by many, caused confusion and concern for some traditionalists. There were unresolved challenges, too. Vatican reform moved slowly, the abuse scandal remained a deep wound, internal polarization persisted.
And reactions to his broader stances on the environment, the economy.
Strong support from many, but also those accusations of politicization from others.
So perhaps his truest legacy lies in the questions he forced us all to ask.
I think that might be it. What does it really mean to follow Christ today? How do we balance truth and mercy, tradition and renewal, identity and openness?
He consistently chose bridges over walls.
Preached hope over cynicism, called for tenderness over indifference. He kept pulling focus back to first principles. See Christ in the poor, build solidarity, understand that faith demands engagement with the world's problems.
Maybe not a complete reformer, but someone who reoriented the church's gaze.
That feels right. He turned the church's face outwards, towards the world and its wounds. And he reminded everyone, Catholic or not, that maybe true greatness isn't in dominance, but in service.
He left behind a path then.
A path, yes. Imperfect maybe, with challenges still remaining, but clearly marked by mercy, courage, and a deep, unwavering love. A path pointing towards dignity, justice, and peace.
A powerful legacy to consider. Understanding that whole journey from Buenos Aires to Rome really does give you a richer context for his papacy, his words, his actions.
It highlights those key themes: mercy, humility, that constant engagement with the world's struggles.
It really does. Thank you for walking us through this deep dive. It gives us a lot to think about.
His life is a compelling story of faith in action, shaped by history, experience, and that unwavering commitment to the gospel message as he understood it.
And for you, our listener, perhaps reflect on those principles we've discussed: mercy, service, engagement with complexity. How might those resonate in your own life, your own understanding of compassion in the world today?